There is a number hidden beneath everything you have ever seen or touched or heard. Beneath the music you love and the architecture that moves you and the faces of the people you cannot stop thinking about. Beneath the spiral of a shell and the orbit of a planet and the way a plucked string vibrates in the air and makes something inside your chest respond to it with a recognition. So deep it feels almost like memory. Beneath all of it there is a mathematical structure, a hidden geometry, a code that was not invented by human beings but was discovered by them, slowly and at enormous personal cost, over the course of centuries of observation and intuition and the specific kind of obsessive attention that most comfortable people never find any reason to develop. Most human beings move through their entire lives without ever seeing it. They hear the music, but not the mathematics of the music. They see the beauty, but not the ratios that generate the beauty. They feel the order of the natural world as a vague and pleasant sensation rather than understanding it as the precise and verifiable structure that it actually is. And this comfortable blindness is entirely understandable because seeing the raw code requires a quality of attention that is genuinely difficult and genuinely demanding and that produces, in the people who develop it, a kind of experience that is as close to what the ancient Greeks called the divine as anything available to a human. Consciousness operating within the limits of a mortal body, 2570 years ago, on a small Greek island in the eastern Aegean, a child was born who would spend his entire life trying to teach the rest of humanity to see the code. He would build a community dedicated to this vision. He would make discoveries so fundamental that we still use them every day without knowing his name. He would be worshipped as a god by his followers and hunted as a dangerous revolutionary by his enemies. He would die in circumstances that the historical record has never fully resolved, possibly murdered, possibly in exile, possibly by his own hand, and the mystery of his death is in some ways as revealing as the brilliance of his life. Because what killed him was not ignorance. It was the specific terror that powerful people feel when someone arrives with a vision of the world that makes their own authority look small and accidental and unnecessary. His name was Pythagoras, and he did not simply discover mathematics. He discovered something that mathematics was pointing toward. Something that the numbers themselves seemed to be trying to say to anyone patient and disciplined and brave enough to listen. And what they were saying was this: the universe is not random. The universe is not the arbitrary playground of gods who could rearrange it on a whim. The universe is structured. It is lawful. It operates according to principles that exist independent of human belief or divine caprice. And those principles can be understood. And a mind that truly understands them is not merely more intelligent than a mind that does not, but is operating at a different level of reality altogether, is touching something real in a way that most human experience, however vivid and however intensely felt, simply does not. This is why the powerful people of his world were afraid of him. Because he was not offering people comfort or reassurance, or the specific pleasure of being told that the gods were on their side and that their suffering had divine meaning. He was offering them something more radical and more disturbing than any of that. He was offering them the truth, and the truth, as Pythagoras understood it, and as every serious philosopher since has confirmed, does not particularly care about the political arrangements and the religious hierarchies and the social structures that human beings have constructed to manage the anxiety of not understanding why they are here. But before we can understand what, he discovered, we have to understand where he came from, and why the specific combination of his origins and his temperament and his historical moment produced a mind capable of the particular and extraordinary thing he was about to do. Samos, in the 6th century BC, was not a provincial backwater. It was one of the most cosmopolitan and intellectually active places in the Greek world, positioned at the intersection of the Eastern Mediterranean trading routes and carrying on commercial and cultural relationships with Egypt and Babylon and the great cities of the Phoenician coast. A place where a curious and attentive child would have encountered, from the earliest possible age, the fact that the world was larger and stranger and more various than any single cultural tradition could contain, and that the questions that the Greek tradition was asking about the nature of reality were also being asked, in different languages and through different frameworks and with different conclusions, by people who had been thinking about them for considerably longer than the Greeks had. Pythagoras was born on Samos around 570 BCE, the son of a merchant named Minisagus, who traveled extensively through the Eastern Mediterranean for his trade. Some ancient sources describe Minisagus as a gem engraver and trader in precious stones, a man whose work required not only commercial acumen but a sensitivity to form and proportion and the specific qualities of material that would have been, for a perceptive child watching his father work, an early and concrete education in the relationship between mathematical precision and aesthetic beauty. The way a stone cut correctly catches the light differently from a stone cut approximately. The way proportion is not merely a mathematical abstraction, but something the eye and the hand can feel. The ancient biographical tradition surrounding Pythagoras is complicated by a fundamental problem that honest scholarship must acknowledge directly. He wrote nothing, not a single text, survives from his own hand. Everything we know about him comes from sources written centuries after his death, by philosophers and historians who were themselves working from traditions and oral accounts and earlier lost texts, and some of what they report is clearly legendary. The accounts of miraculous powers and divine parentage and the ability to be in two places at once that accumulated around his name in the centuries following his death. These should be treated with appropriate skepticism, but the core of what the ancient sources agree upon, the travels, the education, the founding of the community at Croton, the mathematical discoveries, the eventual flight and death. These form a coherent biographical picture that most serious scholars accept as substantially historical, even if its precise details cannot always be confirmed. What the ancient sources agree upon most consistently is that Pythagoras was educated with extraordinary breadths and depth, traveling to Egypt and spending years there under the instruction of the priests of Memphis, who were the custodians of a mathematical and astronomical tradition of great antiquity and considerable sophistication. Spending time in Babylon, where the Chaldean astronomers had been mapping the movements of the heavens with a precision that no Greek of his period could have matched from domestic resources alone, and possibly traveling further to Persia and perhaps even to India, though the evidence for the most distant journeys is thinner and more contested than for the Egyptian and Babylonian periods. What this education gave him was not merely a collection of knowledge assembled from different traditions. It gave him something more valuable and more transformative than any specific piece of mathematical or astronomical information. It gave him a comparative perspective. The experience of looking at the same reality through multiple different intellectual frameworks simultaneously and discovering that, beneath the differences of language and symbol and cultural context, the same patterns kept appearing, the same ratios, the same proportions, the same geometric relationships, as if the universe was leaving the same signature in every place and every tradition that looked carefully enough to find it. This comparative perspective was not available to any philosopher who stayed at home and worked within a single tradition. It required the specific and costly experience of displacement, of becoming genuinely foreign to every context you inhabited, of losing the comfortable certainty that comes from being embedded in a single cultural world and discovering instead the disorienting and eventually liberating recognition that the truth is not the property of any culture, but is something that every culture is trying, with varying degrees of success and various degrees of distortion, to point toward. But the journey that mattered most for what Pythagoras would eventually build was not the journey to Egypt or to Babylon. It was the journey inward, the years of contemplative practice and mathematical investigation that appear from the scattered evidence of the ancient sources, to have occupied the middle period of his life in a way that was not merely intellectual but almost monastic. The specific and disciplined withdrawal from ordinary social life that is required to think about genuinely difficult problems at the depth those problems demand. And the question he was thinking about most deeply and most persistently was one that sounds simple and reveals itself on examination to be among the most profound that a human mind has ever asked: what is the world made of? Not what does the world look like, not how does the world behave in its surface appearances, but what is the world actually made of at the level beneath the surface? What is the fundamental substance or principle or structure that underlies all? The particular and various things that human beings encounter in the course of their lives. This was the central question of the pre-Socratic philosophical tradition that Pythagoras belonged to and eventually transformed, and the answers that his predecessors had proposed, that the fundamental substance was water, or air, or fire, or an undifferentiated primal stuff called the apeiron, were all answers that shared a common assumption, the assumption that the world's most fundamental level was a kind of stuff, a material substance that had form and extension and could be observed and measured. Pythagoras proposed something so radical that it took his contemporaries time to understand what he was actually saying. He proposed that the world was not made of stuff at all. The world was made of number, not of a material substance that could be counted or measured, but of number itself, of mathematical relationships, of the ratios and proportions that governed how things related to each other. And this proposal was not a metaphor or a poetic fancy, but a precise and testable claim about the nature of reality. A claim that he was prepared to support with evidence drawn from the observation of the physical world. The discovery that anchored this extraordinary claim, the discovery that Pythagoras is credited with making, and that the ancient tradition presents as the moment when the veil between ordinary experience and the mathematical structure beneath it first became transparent, was a discovery of the mathematical basis of musical harmony, the demonstration that the intervals that the human ear recognizes as consummate and beautiful, the octave, the fifth, the fourth, are not arbitrary or culturally determined, but are expressions of precise numerical ratios that exist in the physical world, independent of any human preference or cultural convention. Pluck a string and then pluck the same string stopped at its precise midpoint, and the note produced is exactly one octave higher. The ratio of the two string lengths is 2 to 1. Pluck the full string and then stop it at 2/3 of its length, and the interval produced is the perfect fifth. The most harmonious relationship between two notes available to the human ear. The ratio is 3 to 2. Stop the string at 3/4 of its length, and the interval is the perfect fourth. The ratio is 4 to 3. The beautiful relationships that music produces. The consonances that seem to speak directly to something deep and non-rational, in human psychology, are not mysterious or inexplicable. They are the sound of mathematical ratios becoming audible. This discovery hit Pythagoras with the force of a revelation, and it is not difficult to understand why, because what it demonstrated was not merely an interesting fact about music, but something about the fundamental structure of reality. It demonstrated that the universe was not silent about its own nature, that it was speaking continuously and precisely in the language of number, and that human beings, in their experience of musical beauty, were not merely having a pleasant sensory experience, but were encountering, through the medium of sound, the mathematical structure of the universe itself. The implications of this spread outward from music in every direction. If the harmonious intervals of music were mathematical ratios, then the experience of musical beauty was not subjective in the way that we typically assume aesthetic experience to be. It was objective. It was a response to a mathematical truth. And if that was true of music, then perhaps it was true of visual beauty as well. Perhaps the proportions that the eye found beautiful were not arbitrary cultural preferences, but mathematical relationships that corresponded to something real in the structure of the world. And if that was true of beauty, then perhaps it was true of everything. Perhaps the entire universe was organized according to mathematical principles that the human mind could discover and understand. And that discovery would constitute not merely knowledge, but a kind of participation in the deepest level of reality. This is the vision that Pythagoras spent the rest of his life pursuing and teaching and organizing communities around. And it is a vision of extraordinary power and psychological appeal, because it offers human beings something that very few other worldviews have ever offered with comparable conviction. It offers them the possibility of genuine and verifiable contact with the truth. Not the truth as mediated by a religious authority or a political leader or a cultural tradition, but the truth as it actually is, as mathematics demonstrates it to be, as any person who does the work carefully enough can verify for themselves. But before Pythagoras could teach this vision to the world, he had to find the right place to build the institution that would make the teaching possible. And the place he chose, and the institution he built there, and the specific and eventually catastrophic way the institution related to the political world around it, would determine everything that happened next. Pythagoras arrived in Croton in southern Italy around 531 BCE. A man of approximately 40 years, who had spent 2 decades traveling and studying and thinking, and was now ready to build something. Not merely to teach philosophy to whoever happened to be willing to listen, but to create a total institution. A community organized around the pursuit of mathematical and philosophical truth as a complete way of life, rather than as an academic exercise conducted within the comfortable framework of ordinary social existence. The Pythagorean community at Croton was unlike anything that had existed in the Greek world before it. And understanding what it was is essential to understanding both the extraordinary intellectual achievements it produced and the violent and ultimately fatal political crisis that destroyed it. Because the community was not simply a school in the sense of a place where students gathered to hear lectures. It was a brotherhood, a religious and philosophical order with its own rules and its own rituals and its own hierarchy and its own demanding requirements for membership that set its members apart from the ordinary social world as clearly and as permanently as any monastic order. To join the Pythagorean community was to undergo a transformation. Not merely in education, the process of initiation lasted years, beginning with a period of silence, a requirement that the candidates spend up to 5 years in the community without speaking, only listening, only observing, only absorbing the mathematical and philosophical tradition of the brotherhood before being permitted to contribute to it. And this requirement of silence was not an arbitrary disciplinary exercise, but a genuine philosophical practice. The recognition that genuine understanding of anything requires a quality of attention that is incompatible with the perpetual performance of oneself that ordinary social life demands. The community practiced a strict vegetarianism, abstaining from meat not merely for health reasons, but for philosophical and religious ones, rooted in the Pythagorean doctrine of the transmigration of souls, the belief that the soul passed through multiple lives in multiple bodies, human and animal, over an extended cycle of reincarnation, and that the soul in an animal body was as real and as significant as the soul in a human body, and therefore deserved the same moral consideration. This doctrine, which Pythagoras had likely encountered in some form during his travels in Egypt and India, and which he had integrated into his own philosophical system, had profound ethical implications that extended far beyond diet. It meant that the boundary between the human and the natural world was less absolute than ordinary experience, suggested that the separation between the human and the animal was a matter of circumstance rather than of fundamental nature. The community abstained from beans, a prohibition that has puzzled commentators for 2,000 years and has been explained in every possible way, from the dietary to the political to the mystical. The most persuasive recent scholarly explanation suggests that the bean prohibition was connected to the Pythagorean withdrawal from political life. Since in the democracy of the ancient Greek world, beans were used as tokens in the selection of citizens for public office by lot, and refusing to touch beans was a way of making visible and concrete the community's refusal to participate in the ordinary mechanisms of civic life. And this withdrawal from political life was itself a deeply considered philosophical position, not a passive disengagement, but an active and principled rejection of the idea that the pursuit of mathematical and philosophical truth was compatible with the compromises and the tactical dishonesty and the perpetual subordination of genuine principle to the requirements of public opinion that participation in democratic or oligarchic political life necessarily involved. Pythagoras was not indifferent to the political world. He was deeply concerned with the question of how human societies should be organized, and what kind of governance was most consistent with genuine human flourishing. But he believed that the answer to that question had to be derived from philosophical principles rather than arrived at through the ordinary mechanisms of political competition. The community he built at Croton was, among other things, a model of how a society organized around philosophical truth might actually function. And for approximately 30 years, it functioned with remarkable effectiveness. The Pythagoreans became the dominant intellectual and eventually the dominant political force in Croton and in many of the other Greek cities of southern Italy. Their members occupied positions of authority not because they sought power in the ordinary sense, but because the quality of their thinking and the consistency of their ethical practice generated the kind of trust and respect that genuine authority requires, and that the ordinary instruments of political ambition can simulate but cannot sustain over long periods. During these decades, the mathematical and philosophical work of the community produced discoveries of extraordinary power and lasting significance. The Pythagorean theorem, the relationship between the sides of a right triangle that every schoolchild in the world encounters in their mathematical education, and that bears Pythagoras' name, was known in some form to the Babylonians and Egyptians long before Pythagoras, but the Pythagorean community appears to have been the first to prove it. to demonstrate not merely that the relationship was empirically reliable, but that it was mathematically necessary, that it could not have been otherwise. And this distinction between empirical observation and mathematical proof was itself one of the most significant intellectual innovations of the ancient world. The recognition that mathematics was not merely a tool for measuring and calculating, but a domain of necessary truth that was qualitatively different from the contingent truths of observation and experience. The community also discovered, and this discovery had philosophical consequences that were far more disturbing than the Pythagorean theorem, the existence of irrational numbers, the discovery that the square root of 2, the number that represents the length of the diagonal of a unit square, could not be expressed as the ratio of any two whole numbers, that there were lengths in the real world, lengths that could be physically constructed with a ruler and compass, that could not be captured by the mathematical language of ratios, that Pythagoras had built his entire philosophical vision upon. This discovery was, for the Pythagorean community, not merely a mathematical puzzle, but an existential crisis, because the philosophical claim at the heart of the Pythagorean vision was that reality was fundamentally rational, fundamentally expressible in the language of whole number ratios, and the square root of 2 was demonstrating that this claim was not entirely true, that there were aspects of reality that were irrational in a precise mathematical sense, that escaped the net of whole number relationships entirely. The ancient sources report that a member of the community named Hippasus, who either discovered or publicized this result, was thrown into the sea by his fellow Pythagoreans, and whether or not this account is literally true, it conveys something genuine about the intensity of the threat that irrational numbers pose to the community's foundational beliefs. But we are moving ahead of the story, because before the internal crisis of the irrational numbers, there was an external crisis of considerably more immediate and more physical danger, a crisis that would eventually destroy the community, scatter its members, and transform Pythagoras from a living teacher into a legend whose actual historical substance was already becoming difficult to distinguish from the mythological elaborations that his followers had been constructing around his name since the beginning. The political crisis that destroyed the Pythagorean community at Croton was a long time building, and understanding it requires understanding something about the specific and dangerous position that the community had occupied in the political life of southern Italy for several decades. The Pythagoreans had been politically influential in Croton and in the surrounding cities, not as a formal political party, but as a network of philosophical allies whose shared values and shared intellectual framework gave them a coherence and a reliability that ordinary political alliances typically lacked. When Pythagorean members of different cities needed to cooperate on something, they cooperated, because their commitment to the community's values was stronger than their local political loyalties. This coherence, this ability to maintain consistent values and consistent cooperation across multiple political contexts, was enormously valuable when the community was using it in service of generally beneficial goals: the reform of corrupt local governments, the promotion of justice and equitable law, the education of the young in mathematical and philosophical disciplines that made them more effective and more ethical citizens and leaders. And for approximately 3 decades, this is more or less what the community was doing, and the cities of southern Italy were, on balance, better governed and more philosophically sophisticated for its presence. But the same coherence that made the community such an effective force for good also made it, in the eyes of those outside it, a potentially frightening concentration of coordinated power, a network of people whose primary loyalty was not to any city or any democratic assembly or any of the ordinary mechanisms of political accountability, but to a philosophical brotherhood, whose ultimate authority was a single, extraordinary individual who was widely believed by his followers to be something more than human. A man named Cylon, a citizen of Croton who had been rejected for membership in the Pythagorean community, possibly because of an arrogance of character that was incompatible with the community's requirements for philosophical self-examination, became the focal point of the opposition that had been building for years against the Pythagorean influence in Croton. His personal resentment provided the emotional fuel, and his political skill provided the organizational capacity for a campaign against the community that eventually became violent. The precise sequence of events is disputed in the ancient sources, but the general outline is clear. A mob attacked the house where the Pythagoreans were meeting. The building was burned. Many members of the community were killed, and Pythagoras himself either escaped or was not present. The accounts vary. Some ancient sources say he fled to Metapontum in southern Italy, where he died shortly afterward. Some say he was captured and killed. Some say he starved himself to death in a temple of the Muses, refusing food for 40 days rather than surrendering. The philosophical vision that his life had been built around. What is certain is that the community was destroyed, not completely and not permanently, because Pythagorean philosophical traditions survived and continued to develop for centuries after the death of Pythagoras himself. But the specific institution that he had built at Croton, the community organized around the daily practice of mathematical and philosophical truth as a total way of life, that was gone. And its destruction was not the result of a philosophical debate or an intellectual refutation or the ordinary processes by which ideas are tested and sometimes found wanting. It was the result of violence, of the specific and ancient and entirely predictable mechanism by which people who are afraid of what an idea implies for their own power and their own position respond to that fear. The Pythagorean community threatened the political status quo not because it was seeking power in the ordinary sense, but because the alternative vision of human organization that it embodied was genuinely more compelling than what the ordinary political world had to offer. A community organized around truth and mathematical precision, and the common pursuit of genuine understanding was, to anyone who had experienced it, more satisfying and more meaningful than a community organized around the competition for resources and status and the management of the fears and resentments that competition always generates. And this alternative attractiveness was precisely what made it threatening, because a world where more and more people found the Pythagorean way of life more appealing than the ordinary political world was a world where the mechanisms of ordinary political power would find it increasingly difficult to maintain their authority. But the ideas did not die with the community. And this is where the story of Pythagoras becomes something larger than the story of a single man or a single institution. Because the mathematical and philosophical vision that he spent his life developing and teaching turned out to be genuinely indestructible in a way that the community that housed it was not. The ideas passed through the filter of the community's destruction and emerged on the other side, still intact, still powerful, still capable of generating new insights and new connections and new understandings in the minds of the people who encountered them. Plato, who was born approximately 100 years after Pythagoras, and who encountered the Pythagorean tradition through the Pythagorean philosophers of southern Italy during his travels in his early 30s, was so profoundly influenced by the Pythagorean vision that scholars have debated for centuries how much of what we think of as Platonic philosophy is actually Pythagorean in origin. The Platonic doctrine that the material world we perceive through our senses is a less real, the version of a higher mathematical and formal reality that exists independent of material instantiation. The idea that numbers and geometric forms are not merely human inventions, but genuine objects of knowledge that exist in a dimension of reality more fundamental than the physical world. These are ideas that trace their ancestry directly to Pythagoras. And Plato's dialogues are filled with mathematical arguments and mathematical imagery in a way that would be inexplicable if the Pythagorean vision had not already established. In the Greek philosophical tradition, the idea that mathematics was the language of genuine truth. But the most direct and most dramatic confirmation of the Pythagorean vision came not from within the philosophical tradition, but from the natural science of the early modern period. From the discoveries of Kepler and Galileo and Newton in the 16th and 17th centuries that demonstrated, with a precision and a comprehensiveness that the ancient world had never been able to achieve, that the universe truly was organized according to mathematical principles, that the orbits of the planets followed mathematical laws that could be expressed in precise numerical ratios, that the motion of falling bodies and projectiles followed mathematical equations that were derivable from a small number of fundamental physical principles, that the universe was, in a sense, more literal and more exact than Pythagoras himself could have demonstrated. Made of number, Johannes Kepler, who discovered in the early 17th century that the orbital periods of the planets around the Sun were related to their distances from the Sun by a precise mathematical ratio, and who had spent decades searching for the mathematical structure of the solar system because he was a Pythagorean in his philosophical convictions and believed before he had the evidence that the mathematical structure must be there, wrote about his discovery with an emotional intensity that reads less like the report of a scientific finding and more like the testimony of a person who has encountered something sacred. He heard, he said, the music of the spheres, the harmony of the cosmos that Pythagoras had postulated 2,000 years before, and that the intervening centuries had neither confirmed nor refuted, but had simply passed along as a vision too extraordinary to dismiss and too ambitious to prove. And Kepler was right to hear it as music, because the connection between his discovery and Pythagoras' original insight about the musical ratios was not merely metaphorical, it was structural. Both were expressions of the same fundamental truth, that the universe was organized according to mathematical relationships that could be discovered by patient observation and expressed in precise numerical ratios, that the beauty the human mind perceived in music and in the movements of the heavens was not an illusion or a projection, but a genuine response to a genuine mathematical order that pervaded reality at every level. Galileo, who transformed the way science was done by insisting that the book of nature was written in the language of mathematics and that anyone who wanted to read it had to learn that language or remain forever outside its meaning, was making a claim that Pythagoras would have recognized immediately as a restatement of his own central insight in the specific vocabulary of the new experimental science. The universe speaks in mathematics, and the human mind that learns to listen in mathematical terms is not merely acquiring a useful tool, but is developing the capacity to hear what the universe is actually saying. Newton. Who derived the mathematical laws that describe the motion of every object in the universe from a few fundamental principles and a mathematical framework of extraordinary elegance and power, was himself deeply convinced that the mathematical structure of the universe was not something he had invented, but something he had found. That it was there before any human mind had looked for it, and would be there long after every human mind had ceased to look. And this conviction that mathematical truth is discovered rather than invented, that the relationships between numbers and the structures of geometry exist in a realm of reality independent of human thought, is the philosophical position that Pythagoras had articulated first, and that the subsequent history of mathematics and natural science had been, in some sense, a 2,000-year process of confirming. But it was not only in the philosophy of mathematics and in the history of natural science that the Pythagorean vision left its mark. It left its mark in art and architecture and music, in ways that were sometimes acknowledged and sometimes not. The golden ratio, the mathematical proportion approximately 1.618 to 1 that appears in the proportions of the Parthenon and in the spiral of the Nautilus shell, and in the spacing of seeds in a sunflower head, and in the dimensions of the human face that are typically found most beautiful. This ratio was known to the Pythagoreans and was understood by them not as an arbitrary aesthetic preference, but as a mathematical expression of a universal principle of beauty, a ratio that the universe itself preferred and that the human eye found beautiful precisely because it was encountering, through the medium of visual proportion, the same mathematical structure that the ear encountered in the consonant intervals of music. The architects and artists of the Renaissance who rediscovered the mathematical proportions of classical Greek art and architecture were not merely reviving a stylistic preference, they were reconnecting with the Pythagorean insight that beauty was not arbitrary, that the proportions that generated it were mathematically determined and could be studied and understood and applied with a precision that ordinary aesthetic intuition, however refined, could not achieve on its own. Luca Pacioli, the Renaissance mathematician, who wrote the influential treatise on the divine proportion in 1499, and who worked closely with Leonardo da Vinci, was explicitly Pythagorean. In his conviction that the mathematical ratios of beauty were not human inventions, but expressions of divine order, of the mathematical structure that Pythagoras had insisted lay beneath everything. And in music, the Pythagorean legacy was not merely philosophical, but practical. The mathematical system of tuning that Pythagoras developed from his original discovery of the ratios of musical harmony, the system known as Pythagorean tuning, was the dominant system of musical tuning in European music for over 1,000 years. And the debates about tuning systems that occupied European music theory from the medieval period through the Renaissance and into the early modern period were, at their root, debates about the implications of the Pythagorean vision, about whether the mathematical ratios that Pythagoras had identified were truly the fundamental structure of musical harmony, or whether they needed to be modified and adjusted to accommodate the actual practice of music making in a world more complex and more various than the Pythagorean system's clean mathematical ratios could fully account for. These debates have never been fully resolved, because the question they are addressing is one that Pythagoras himself identified, but that the mathematical and philosophical tools of his period could not fully answer. The question of the relationship between mathematical perfection and the beautiful but imperfect reality of actual physical experience. Whether the ideal mathematical ratios that generate the most consummate intervals are the right standard against which to measure musical practice, or whether the messier but more richly expressive compromises that actual music requires are themselves a kind of truth that the clean mathematical ideals cannot fully capture. And this is, at a deeper level, the same question that the discovery of irrational numbers had posed to the Pythagorean community. The question of whether reality is entirely rational, whether the mathematical structure that Pythagoras had found so compelling was complete, or whether there were aspects of reality that escaped it. The honest answer, the answer that 2,500 years of mathematical and philosophical investigation have gradually made clear, is both. Reality is mathematical in ways that are so deep and so comprehensive and so continuously surprising that no serious thinker in any field can deny the force of the Pythagorean insight. The universe speaks in mathematics, and any mind that wants to understand it at the deepest level available must learn to speak that language. And at the same time, reality is stranger and more complex, and in some fundamental ways more resistant to complete mathematical description than the Pythagorean vision in its pure form allowed. And the tension between these two truths, the mathematical order of the universe and the irreducible mystery that remains even within that order, is itself one of the most generative and most important tensions in the history of human thought. We live now in a world that confirms the Pythagorean vision so completely and so precisely that Pythagoras himself would be both astonished and vindicated by it. The standard model of particle physics, the most accurate and most comprehensive description of the fundamental constituents of matter and the forces between them that human science has ever achieved, is entirely mathematical in its structure. It is not a description of what particles look like or what they feel like or what they are made of in any intuitive material sense. It is a description of the mathematical relationships that govern their behavior. And the mathematical structure of that description is so beautiful, so precisely economical, so elegantly organized that the physicists who work with it consistently describe their encounter with it in terms that are closer to aesthetic experience than to practical utility. It is beautiful, they say, and they mean something specific and verifiable by this, that the mathematics has a quality of inevitability and rightness that goes beyond mere accuracy and enters the territory that Pythagoras was exploring when he listened to the harmonious intervals of music and heard in them not merely pleasant sounds, but the mathematical voice of the universe speaking about its own nature. The quantum mechanical description of reality, which is the most accurate description of physical reality that human science has ever produced, is organized around mathematical structures of extraordinary elegance, the wave functions that describe the probable states of quantum systems, the operators that correspond to observable physical quantities, the mathematical relationships between them that generate the predictions that experiments have confirmed to extraordinary precision. All of this is mathematics, pure and rigorous, and in some sense more real than the physical reality it describes. Because the mathematics is what we actually know with precision and certainty, and the physical reality is what we infer from the mathematics and then test against our instruments. Max Wigner, one of the great mathematical physicists of the 20th century, wrote a famous paper about what he called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences. The puzzle of why mathematics, which was developed by human beings primarily as an abstract intellectual exercise, without any immediate reference to physical reality, turned out to describe physical reality with a precision and a comprehensiveness that went far beyond anything That could be explained by the practical utility that motivated the mathematics' original development. It was unreasonable, Witness said, that the abstract mathematical investigations of pure mathematicians should turn out to be precisely what the physicists needed to describe the fundamental structure of the universe, and he was right to find it unreasonable, because there is no obvious reason why it should be true, unless, of course, it is true because Pythagoras was right. Unless the mathematics is not merely a tool that human beings invented and then discovered happened to fit the universe, but is the actual language in which the universe is written, the structure within which physical reality exists rather than a description that we apply to it from outside. And if that is true, if the Pythagorean vision of a universe made of number is not merely a metaphor or a philosophical position, but an accurate description of the way things actually are, then the 2,500 years of mathematical and scientific progress since Pythagoras first plucked the string and heard the octave and understood what it meant have not been a journey away from him, but a journey deeper into the vision he had first articulated, a confirmation of increasing precision and increasing scope of what he saw with brilliant and lonely clarity in a garden in Samos, or in a school in Croton, or in whatever private moment of contemplation the original insight arrived in. And this is the sense in which Pythagoras is not a historical figure, in the way that most historical figures are historical figures. Not a person whose significance lies in what they accomplished in their own time, and whose relationship to the present is one of interesting but ultimately retrospective relevance. Pythagoras is, in a way that very few thinkers from any period of history can claim, a contemporary, a person whose central insight is more relevant now than it has ever been before, because the evidence for it has never been more compelling and the tools for exploring its implications have never been more powerful. Every time a physicist describes the fundamental forces of nature in terms of mathematical symmetries, every time a biologist finds a Fibonacci sequence in the branching pattern of a plant or the arrangement of scales on a pinnacone, every time an engineer uses the mathematical ratios of harmonic resonance to design a structure that can withstand vibration, every time a musician tunes an instrument by ear and hears the beating of two frequencies approaching and reaching and passing through a mathematical ratio, Pythagoras is present, not as a ghost or a legend, but as the person who first understood that these were all expressions of the same underlying truth, that the universe spoke in mathematics, and that listening to it was not merely an intellectual exercise but a form of contact with the deepest level of reality available to a human consciousness. But understanding the magnitude of what Pythagoras contributed also requires understanding what it cost him and what it costs anyone who takes the mathematical vision of reality seriously enough to live inside it rather than merely admire it from a comfortable distance. Because the Pythagorean commitment to truth is the fundamental value, the refusal to compromise the mathematical precision of the philosophical vision for the sake of social or political convenience, was not merely an intellectual position but a total way of life that made extraordinary demands on anyone who embraced it and generated extraordinary resentments in anyone who felt threatened by it. The community at Croton was destroyed not because it failed but because it succeeded, because the alternative vision of human organization it embodied, organized around truth rather than power, around mathematical precision rather than political manipulation, around the common pursuit of genuine understanding rather than the competitive acquisition of resources and status, was genuinely more compelling than what the ordinary political world had to offer. And the people who had invested their lives in the ordinary political world understood even if only unconsciously, that a world where more and more people found the Pythagorean way of life more appealing was a world where their own authority and their own position became progressively less secure. This dynamic, the systematic persecution of those who see the mathematical and philosophical truth clearly enough to make the social constructions of power look provisional and arbitrary, is not merely an ancient Greek phenomenon, it is a recurring pattern in the history of ideas. The person who understands something so clearly that the understanding itself becomes threatening to those who benefit from the existing confusion. The Galileo placed under house arrest for confirming that the earth moved around the sun. The Cantor driven to madness by the professional hostility of the mathematical establishment to his theory of infinite sets. The Ramonian arriving from India with mathematical insights so profound that the British mathematical establishment could not initially believe they were genuine. These are all variations on the Pythagorean story, all instances of the same ancient and depressing dynamic, in which clarity about the mathematical structure of reality generates resistance from those who are more comfortable with the existing arrangements. And this is, perhaps, the deepest and most uncomfortable dimension of the Pythagorean legacy, the recognition that seeing the mathematical truth clearly is not merely an intellectual achievement, but a political act. That the pursuit of genuine understanding is never entirely separate from the social and political context in which it takes place. That the world that Pythagoras was pointing toward, a world organized around mathematical truth rather than political power, is still not the world we actually inhabit, and that the distance between the world we have and the world his vision implied is itself one of the most significant and most challenging facts about the human condition. The code is real. It is there, beneath every surface of everything you have ever seen or touched or heard. The mathematics is real, and its relationship to physical reality is not arbitrary or contingent, but necessary and deep, and in some sense more fundamental than the physical reality it describes. Pythagoras was right about that, right in a way that 2,500 years of increasingly precise investigation have continuously confirmed and never refuted. And at the same time, the world that takes this truth seriously, that organizes itself around mathematical precision and philosophical honesty and the common pursuit of genuine understanding, is still a vision rather than a reality, still a garden that keeps getting burned down before it can grow to its full size. Still a possibility that the best human minds keep rediscovering and the ordinary mechanisms of power keep finding ways to suppress. Pythagoras died, probably in Metapontum, probably around 495 BCE. The precise circumstances genuinely uncertain, and the ancient sources genuinely conflicted about what actually happened in the final period of his life. What is not uncertain is what he left behind. He left behind a mathematical tradition of extraordinary power and fecundity that would eventually, through the work of the people who built on his foundations, produce the mathematical language in which the universe has turned out to be written. He left behind a philosophical vision of such depth and such prescience that 2,500 years of subsequent philosophy and natural science have been, in the largest sense, a working out of its implications, and he left behind the example of a human life organized around truth as the highest value, a life that paid the price that such an organization always seems to exact, and that generated, in exchange for that price, something that outlasted the person who paid it by more than 2 millennia and shows no signs of running out. The next time you hear a piece of music that moves you in a way you cannot fully explain, that seems to speak to something in you that is deeper than preference or memory or cultural conditioning, The next time you look at a beautiful building and feel the proportions of it as something more than an aesthetic pleasure, as something that seems almost to confirm something you already knew. The next time you look at the night sky and feel the specific and vertiginous recognition that the stars are not scattered randomly but arranged in patterns that can be described and measured and understood in mathematical terms. Know that what you are experiencing is not merely a personal response, not merely the accident of your particular sensory apparatus or your particular cultural background, but a genuine encounter with the mathematical structure of the universe, an encounter that Pythagoras was the first human being to understand. Clearly enough to describe, the number is beneath everything. It has always been there. And the man who first heard it clearly enough to tell the rest of us what it sounded like paid for that hearing with his life, and gave us, in exchange, a vision of the universe that the subsequent centuries have been validating, elaborating, extending, and applying in ways that have transformed every dimension of human life and understanding, and that show no signs of being exhausted, because the universe is still speaking in the language he identified, and the human mind is still, slowly and imperfectly and with frequent reversions to comfortable ignorance, learning to listen. If this journey into the mind and the mathematics and the dangerous vision of Pythagoras has changed how you hear the music or see the geometry or understand the silence beneath the surface of ordinary experience, then you are already inside the tradition he founded, already participating in the continuous and never-finished project of learning to read the universe in its own language. Subscribe and stay with this channel, because every story we tell here is another layer of that same project. Another person who looked at the world with unusual precision and paid the price of seeing it clearly and left behind something that the world needed even when the world did not know it needed it. Leave a comment telling us what you heard in Pythagoras' story that you recognized in your own life, because the recognition is where the understanding begins, and the understanding, as Pythagoras insisted with everything he had, is where the genuine human life becomes possible.